Black woman ordered to give up VIP seat for white passenger. One call gets the entire crew fired. Ma'am, are you sure you're in the right seat? Maya Carter had heard those words before, too many times, but this time, she wasn't letting it slide. By the time the plane landed, one phone call would change everything, and the entire crew would regret ever underestimating her. But the real question is, how far would they go to push her out of a seat she rightfully paid for? Before we dive in, comment your city and country below, and if you enjoy stories that keep you on the edge, make sure to subscribe so you never miss one. Let's dive into the story. Amara Wells stepped onto the plane with the quiet confidence of a woman who had worked hard for every success she had achieved. At 38, she was the CEO of one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the country, and this flight was the final step towards sealing a major international deal. Clad in a tailored navy blue suit with her natural curls framing her face, she carried herself with grace and certainty, but she knew from experience that no amount of success could shield her from the biases of the world. As she walked into the first-class section, she noticed the quick glance from the flight attendant, a blonde woman in her mid-40 seconds with a tight smile. It wasn't an overtly hostile look, but it carried the kind of subtle doubt Amara had seen too many times before. The woman's eyes flicked over Amara's designer bag, then to her face, as if assessing whether she truly belonged in the premium section of the plane. Amara ignored the glance and found her seat, 3A. She placed her carry-on in the overhead compartment and settled in. Just as she was adjusting the armrest, she noticed the same flight attendant approaching another passenger, a white man in a tailored grey suit. The attendant greeted him with a bright smile. "Welcome, Mr. Lucas. Can I take your coat for you?" she asked warmly. Amara arched an eyebrow, but said nothing. She had been in similar situations before, and she knew that sometimes it was best to observe first. A few minutes later, as she reached into her bag for her tablet, she noticed the attendant walking toward her. The woman stopped at Amara's seat and hesitated for a second before speaking. "Ma'am, are you sure you're in the right seat?" Amara inhaled slowly. The question wasn't asked rudely, but the implication was clear. She kept her voice even. "Yes, I'm in the right seat." She reached for her boarding pass and held it up. 3A, first class. The attendant glanced at it, her lips pressing together briefly before forcing a quick nod. "All right, just making sure," she said, before turning and walking away without another word. Amara leaned back in her seat, exhaling softly. It had begun. She had spent her entire career proving she belonged in rooms where people assumed she didn't. And now, she would have to prove she belonged in a seat she had paid for, just like everyone else in first class. Amara tried to push the incident aside, but the weight of it settled in her chest. She had seen this type of thing before, a quiet, polite attempt to question her presence, to make her feel out of place. But she refused to shrink. She turned on her tablet, reviewing the presentation she would deliver upon landing. The numbers were solid, the projections strong. This deal would solidify her company's global expansion, making her one of the most powerful black women in tech. She had earned her place in this seat, in this industry, in this world. The hum of the engines grew as the last passengers boarded. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, with neatly combed brown hair, stopped beside her row. He glanced at her, then at his ticket, then back at her. "You sure you're in the right seat?" he asked, his voice carrying an edge. Amara's grip tightened on her tablet, the second time in 10 minutes. "Yes," she said, looking him straight in the eye. The man frowned and turned toward the flight attendant, the same woman who had questioned Amara earlier. "I think there's a mistake," he said, his voice louder now. "I'm supposed to be in 3A. The attendant hesitated, then took his boarding pass. She studied it, her eyes darting between the ticket and Amara's seat. Then, finally, she shook her head. "Sir, you're in 3B, right next to her." A muscle twitched in the man's jaw. He exhaled sharply, then turned to Amara. "My mistake," he muttered, but his expression said otherwise. Amara didn't respond. She simply watched as he placed his briefcase in the overhead compartment and dropped into the seat beside her, stiff and irritated. The flight attendant lingered for a moment, as if debating whether to say something else. Then, with a curt nod, she walked away. Amara forced herself to refocus. She had worked too hard to let a stranger's attitude rattle her. She had faced worse. But then, the murmurs started. Across the aisle, two businessmen in dark suits exchanged glances. One of them leaned closer to the other and whispered something under his breath. The other smirked. Amara's jaw tightened. She had no proof of what they were saying, but she didn't need to hear the words. She had seen that smirk before. The plane doors closed, and the captain's voice filled the cabin, announcing their flight path and expected arrival time. Amara kept her gaze forward, gripping the armrest as the aircraft began to taxi down the runway. She wouldn't let them get to her. She wouldn't let them win. But something told her this flight was going to be longer than expected. Amara sat stiffly in her seat, her patience wearing thin. She had requested a drink nearly 20 minutes ago, but the flight attendant continued to breeze past her as if she didn't exist. Meanwhile, the white businessman in the next row had been served almost immediately, his glass refilled twice without him even needing to ask. At first, she thought it was an oversight. Planes were busy and mistakes happened, but when she tried again, this time making eye contact and speaking clearly, the flight attendant barely glanced at her. "Excuse me, could I get some water, please?" The woman sighed, rolling her eyes. "Be patient," she snapped before walking away. Amara kept her gaze forward, gripping the armrest as the aircraft began to taxi down the runway. She wouldn't let them get to her. She wouldn't let them win. But something told her this flight was going to be longer than expected. Amara sat stiffly in her seat, her patience wearing thin. She had requested a drink nearly 20 minutes ago, but the flight attendant continued to breeze past her as if she didn't exist. Meanwhile, the white businessman in the next row had been served almost immediately, his glass refilled twice without him even needing to ask. At first, she thought it was an oversight. Planes were busy and mistakes happened, but when she tried again, this time making eye contact and speaking clearly, the flight attendant barely glanced at her. "Excuse me, could I get some water, please?" The woman sighed, rolling her eyes. "Be patient," she snapped before walking away. Amara wasn't having it. She pressed the call button. Seconds later, the same attendant returned, her expression already impatient. "What do you need now?" Amara kept her voice even. "I've been waiting for a drink for quite a while. I told you to be patient," the woman shot back. "We're busy." Amara gestured toward the businessman's refilled glass. "Busy? You've had time to serve others." The attendant's lips thinned. "Ma'am, I don't like your tone." Amara felt her pulse spike. My tone? All she had done was ask for basic service that others were receiving without issue. Another flight attendant, a man, approached. "Is there a problem here?" the woman huffed. "She's being difficult." Amara's breath hitched. Difficult. There it was. The word they always used when a black woman refused to shrink herself. "I just asked for water," Amara said calmly. The male attendant gave her a forced smile. "We'll get to you when we can." But Amara had seen enough to know that "when we can" meant when we feel like it. "I'd like to speak to the head flight attendant," she said firmly. The woman's eyes widened slightly, caught off guard by Amara's refusal to back down. "That won't be necessary. I think it is." Amara met her gaze without flinching. A murmur had started among nearby passengers. A few people had noticed the interaction now, their heads turning. The businessman beside her suddenly seemed uncomfortable, shifting in his seat. Reluctantly, the male attendant left to fetch the lead. Moments later, a new woman approached, this one wearing a name tag that read supervisor. "Is there an issue, ma'am?" she asked, her voice smoother, more professional. Amara didn't hesitate. She recounted the entire experience, making it clear that this wasn't just about a drink. It was about how she was being treated differently from others. The supervisor listened, her expression unreadable. But Amara saw the way she shot a quick glance at the flight attendant, who now looked nervous. A few minutes later, a bottle of water was handed to Amara with an apology. The first flight attendant avoided eye contact, her lips pressed into a thin line. Amara accepted the water, but the damage was already done. She had spoken up, not just for herself, but for every time someone like her had been dismissed, ignored, or treated as an inconvenience. The businessman beside her cleared his throat awkwardly. "Good for you," he muttered. Amara took a slow sip of her water, letting the moment settle. Good for her indeed. Amara pressed the call button, her patience running thin. She had given the situation enough time to resolve itself, but now she was done waiting. A few moments later, a middle-aged woman with a neatly pinned bun and a professional but distant expression approached. "Yes, ma'am? How can I assist you?" Amara sat up straighter, locking eyes with her. "I need to report an incident of discrimination." The senior attendant's smile barely wavered. "Oh, what seems to be the issue?" "The flight attendant serving this section has deliberately ignored my requests while assisting other passengers." The woman's expression remained neutral, but Amara caught the subtle shift, the slight tightening of her lips, the quick flick of her eyes toward the back of the cabin. "I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding," she said with a light chuckle, as if trying to wave away the complaint. Amara clenched her jaw. "It's not a misunderstanding. I was denied service multiple times. I won't be brushed aside." Passengers around them shifted in their seats, pretending not to listen while clearly eavesdropping. Some looked away quickly, while others stole glances, their curiosity evident. The senior attendant sighed. "I'll speak with her, but I want to assure you that all of our staff are trained professionals." Sometimes things can get busy. A voice cut through her excuse. I saw it happen. Amara turned her head. A black male flight attendant stood nearby, his uniform perfectly pressed, his expression guarded. The senior attendant barely glanced at him. I'll handle it, she said, her voice tight, but Amara kept her eyes on him, watching the flicker of hesitation in his expression. He had seen everything. He knew, but would he say more? His lips parted, as if he wanted to speak up, but then, just as quickly, he shut his mouth, squared his shoulders, and nodded slightly before walking away. Amara exhaled sharply. The senior attendant turned back to her. I'll have a word with her, but we don't want to escalate things unnecessarily. Amara raised an eyebrow. Unnecessarily? The woman's smile thinned. I mean, I'm sure there was no ill intent. Amara cut her off. Intent doesn't matter, the impact does. A few passengers whispered among themselves now. Others stole glances in Amara's direction. She felt the weight of the moment pressing on her, but she refused to back down. The senior attendant gave her a tight-lipped nod. I'll speak with her, she repeated, her tone making it clear she wanted to end the conversation. Then, without another word, she walked away. Amara's fingers curled into fists. She had seen this before. The polite dismissal, the empty promise to look into it. This was how these situations played out, until the person on the receiving end either gave up or caused a scene. Neither option worked for her. She glanced around the cabin again. The murmurs had grown louder. More passengers had noticed. And still, nothing was being done. Her eyes found the black flight attendant once more. He was helping another passenger, but she saw it. That tension in his shoulders. The way his eyes flicked toward her before quickly looking away. He was conflicted. Amara turned back toward her seat, her mind racing. Should she let this drop? No, that wasn't an option. She reached for her phone, her pulse steady and determined. If they wanted to ignore her, she would make sure the world didn't. Amara stared at her phone screen, her heart pounding in frustration. Enough was enough. If they thought they could silence her with dismissive smiles and empty reassurances, they were wrong. She tapped the record button. This is happening right now on flight 472, she said, keeping her voice steady but firm. I have been ignored, dismissed, and treated as if I don't exist while other passengers receive full service. And when I spoke up, I was told it was a misunderstanding. She angled the camera slightly, making sure to capture the bustling cabin behind her. Other passengers glanced in her direction, some pretending not to listen, others visibly interested. The tension in the air was thick, pressing down like a storm waiting to break. A few rows ahead, a white woman with stylish blonde hair and an expensive-looking scarf lowered her phone slightly, her fingers subtly adjusting the angle. Amara's sharp eyes caught the movement. The woman wasn't just scrolling, she was recording. Good. Amara wasn't the only one who saw what was happening. She took a breath, then stood. If they wanted her to stay quiet, she was about to do the exact opposite. The rude flight attendant was by the beverage cart again, speaking to another passenger, with that same artificial politeness she hadn't shown Amara. Amara walked up, her phone still recording. Excuse me, she said, her voice cutting through the hum of the cabin. The flight attendant turned, her expression instantly shifting to irritation. Ma'am, I'm assisting another passenger. I'm sure you are, Amara said smoothly, not backing down. Just like you assisted everyone else before me while ignoring my requests. A few nearby passengers turned in their seats. The blonde woman continued recording, her phone angled just enough to catch everything. The flight attendant's lips curled into a smirk. Some people always find something to complain about, she said lightly, as if Amara were a child throwing a tantrum. Amara's grip on her phone tightened. The words hit hard, not because they were unexpected, but because they were so familiar. She had heard them before, in boardrooms, in stores, in subtle little moments where people like this flight attendant gaslit black people into thinking their experiences weren't real. But this time, Amara wasn't alone. A sharp whisper ran through the cabin. More passengers were watching now, their eyes flicking between Amara and the flight attendant. Some looked uncomfortable, others looked intrigued. Amara didn't move. Is that how you see it? She asked, her voice calm but unwavering. A complaint? Not discrimination? The flight attendant gave a small, insincere shrug. I don't control how you feel about things, ma'am. Amara let out a slow breath, steadying herself. She had two choices, walk away, let them win, or stand her ground. She chose the latter. You're right. You don't control how I feel, she said, her voice cool. But you do control how you treat people. And you made a choice. The murmurs grew louder. The tension crackled like static electricity. The flight attendant's smirk faltered for a split second. Amara didn't blink. The blonde woman recording finally spoke. I saw what happened, she said casually, tapping her phone. And I'm sure a lot of other people will too. The flight attendant's face paled just slightly. Amara finally lowered her phone. She didn't need to say anything else. The damage was done. The moment had shifted, and now everyone was watching. Amara remained standing, her presence an unshakable force in the tense cabin. The flight attendant, now visibly uneasy, cast a quick glance toward the front of the plane. Something had shifted. The murmurs among the passengers grew louder. Pockets of whispered conversations buzzing like static in the background. A middle-aged man in a business suit leaned toward his seatmate and muttered, "Did you hear what she said to her?" A young woman nearby, scrolling through her phone, gave a sharp nod. "People are already posting about it," she whispered back. The blonde woman who had been recording earlier was still at it, her phone subtly angled, her lips pressed into a tight, knowing smile. Then the intercom crackled to life. "This is your captain speaking," a deep voice announced. "We've been made aware of a situation involving a passenger and our crew. I want to assure all passengers that we take concerns of discrimination seriously. Our senior flight attendant will be addressing the matter shortly." A collective hush fell over the cabin. Amara kept her gaze steady, watching the flight attendants exchange uneasy glances. The rude one, the woman who had ignored her, dismissed her, and smirked in her face, now stood stiffly, her hands gripping the beverage cart. The power she once wielded so easily was slipping. Footsteps approached. The senior flight attendant, a tall woman with graying hair and a rehearsed professional smile, stepped forward. Her posture was rigid, her face carefully composed, but there was an unmistakable tightness around her mouth. She wasn't here because she wanted to be. She was here because she had to be. She stopped in front of Amara, her hands clasped together in a way that seemed more defensive than apologetic. "Caroline Sutton," she began, her voice smooth but hollow. "I want to personally apologize for any inconvenience or discomfort you may have experienced." Amara arched a brow. Inconvenience? Discomfort? She let the words hang in the air for a moment. Around her, passengers shifted in their seats, waiting to see what she would do next. The blonde woman with the phone was still recording. Amara squared her shoulders. "That's not an apology," she said, her voice carrying through the quiet cabin. The senior attendant blinked, clearly caught off guard. I assure you, we are taking this very seriously." "Are you?" Amara asked. "Because what I experienced wasn't just discomfort, it was outright discrimination. Your crew member dismissed me, ignored me, and when I finally stood up for myself, she belittled me in front of everyone." More murmurs rippled through the cabin. A man a few rows back nodded in agreement. "Yeah, we saw it." Amara didn't break eye contact with the senior attendant. "So let's be clear," she continued, her voice steady. "You're not just going to sweep this under the rug with a half-hearted apology." The senior attendant's jaw tightened. She glanced around, aware of the growing attention. She knew damage control was slipping from her grasp. Amara took a slow breath. Then, loud enough for everyone to hear, she said, "I'll be filing a formal complaint the moment we land." The words landed with weight. The rude flight attendant, who had been trying to shrink into the background, stiffened. The senior attendant's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to argue, but one look at the passengers, at their waiting, expectant faces, told her it was pointless. Amara had the upper hand now, and she wasn't letting it go.